So my name is Shawn Shieh, and I am director of a consulting company called Social Innovations Advisory. And we are doing work in Asia to strengthen the resilience of civil society in the region. And I also have been doing quite a bit of research on the China's Belt and Road over the last 2 years. That's most of my interest these days is on the Belt and Road. So it's good to hear that that will be one of the topics for your meetings. Yeah, I mean, so I think my understanding of the BRI is it's a very, of course, very large and complex undertaking. The focus originally was on infrastructure, because BRI is meant to strengthen connectivity, help connect people by building infrastructure to connect them. So the Chinese often talked about this the Silk Road. The Silk Road was to connect different countries, China and Central Asia, Southeast Asia, as far as Europe. Of course, now that's extended into Africa, to the Pacific, to Latin America. So and it's we were talking about now the Belt and Road, you can say is now in over 100 countries. So it's a very large initiative. I think the first thing to say about Belt and Road, besides that it's very large, is that there's no plan, there is no master plan for the Belt and Road. I mean, nobody can really find any kind of detailed plan about or policies about the Belt and Road. So I think somebody said that Belt and Road was kind of like a brand. It's kind of a campaign, of using a brand to launch a campaign. I think that's kind of a good way to think about it. It's that so the Chinese government has used this term, the Belt and Road, and then they encourage other companies, the companies and other actors to get involved. And so in China, many companies, universities, and also NGOs are getting involved in Belt and Road, and they use the name Belt and Road, but maybe it doesn't always have to do with the original purpose of Belt and Road, which is about connectivity. In other words, so Belt and Road has become really quite not just large, but it's also kind of gotten, it's not really under any kind of control of the Chinese government. I think the Chinese government does provide some financing, and particularly to the state-owned companies. So I think this is where the government's influence is the greatest. But there's also other actors in the Belt and Road that are doing things on their own, and they're getting maybe their own sources of finance, and they are signing agreements, not always with the, how would you say, the approval of the Chinese government. So if you go to to other countries, and you ask the Chinese embassy and the Economic and Commercial Office are supposed to be responsible for having some kind of say in approving investments, and they should keep track of how many Belt and Road, how many projects there are in that country. But actually, they don't really have good information about that. Maybe they will say, well, we know that there are 50 companies in this country, but actually there's actually many more than 50, because they don't know. There's so many Chinese actors that are now using the Belt and Road, this brand, to do things in other countries. So it becomes a kind of it's an opportunity for other actors to get involved. But those actors are not always, they're not coordinated by the Chinese government. So I think, that is something that's important to recognize. At the same time, yes, I mean that especially for the big projects and the ones that are carried out by the state-owned companies, there is money, there are loans that are coming from Chinese policy banks, and these companies, the state-owned companies, not only have an economic sort of motive, but they also have a kind of political motive as well, because they want to, represent the Chinese government. They feel a responsibility to show the best side of China. For China, the Belt and Road is an opportunity to also showcase their development model, because China realizes they think they have done a very good job in developing their country. So China used to be quite poor, and now it's actually quite, you can call it maybe a middle-class country, and technologically, it's quite advanced now. So I think the Chinese government certainly should be proud of how much they've been able to achieve. So I think what they want to do now is to export that to other countries, because they think that what they have, the experience that they have gained, can be used usefully in other developing countries to help develop their infrastructure. So I think that's also important to understand as well. So I've done, like I said, I've done quite a bit of research on the social impact of Chinese investment. I haven't done as much about the environmental impact, but more about the social impact. And I've interviewed many people. I've interviewed CSOs, I've interviewed government officials, I've interviewed researchers, and also I've interviewed Chinese companies, but also companies and associations in Africa that represent local companies and so forth. So, I've interviewed a lot of people, and here's some of the, I guess, things that some of the concerns that I have. Some of the key concerns I have about Chinese investment. So I think, probably the biggest concern I have is the weak capacity of governments, those governments in the Belt and Road countries, to regulate Chinese investment. And this is a big problem. I mean, in other words, that the problems that come because of Chinese investment, I mean, yes, I think the Chinese companies should have some responsibility, but also maybe a bigger responsibility is the government in that country. So for example, Chinese investment in Thailand. I mean, the Thai government has a very important responsibility to regulate any kind of foreign investment that comes in. Chinese investment, though, you find in places like Africa, the Chinese are willing to invest, especially in those countries that have a weak kind of governance. They're more willing to invest in those countries than maybe Western companies. They're willing to take more risk. But this means that this can be risky because those governments cannot really regulate well the impact of those Chinese investments. So this is a big problem when it comes, for example, to like labor, because many people often complain about how many Chinese workers come into that country as part of a project. But this is because that government, that government allows those workers to come in, and often those workers they'll stay longer than their visa. And they will just stay in that country, and they will see that this country is a good place to do business, so they will start their own business, right? Maybe they'll open up a Chinese restaurant, or they will open up a store, or something like that. So, I think that's a big concern, that the host government has to do a much better job of regulating the Chinese investment. A second concern I have is the the lack of transparency of the agreements between the Chinese and the other countries, either governments or the companies. I think that a lot of people complain about this when I go to talk to them, and they complain about how it's very difficult to get that information about the agreements. What is in the investment agreement or the loan agreements. And there's some evidence that the Chinese loan agreements are not as transparent as loan agreements maybe with some other countries, like, for example, the Japanese. So I think, this is a big concern. We need to ask for more information about these agreements to know what's in them. Another concern is, I think, when I go to these other countries in Africa or Asia, is to see that, BRI is being used to export China's overcapacity. So China has, for example, too much maybe coal or too much steel, too much of these materials they cannot sell inside China. So the Belt and Road Initiative becomes a way for them to sell it to other countries. Of course, when you talk about selling coal, then that's a big problem, because China said, well, we're going to commit to the climate change agreement, but then they don't use coal. They use less coal in China, but they export it to other countries. So I think Pakistan is a good example of this. Pakistan is a country where a lot of the new coal power plants are invested by by China. And the same thing was with labor, Chinese labor. Chinese have they have too many workers, too many people who need jobs. So those people are going overseas to work in these Belt and Road projects. So I think this is a problem too, and this again is linked to the need to regulate Chinese investment better in those Belt and Road countries. So I think because of that need to export overcapacity in China, the Chinese companies don't give so much priority to local development. So what I mean is that when you sign an agreement for a project, let's say to build a hydropower dam or to build a road or to build a railroad, the Chinese will say, well, we'll just bring our own materials from China. We'll just, we won't need to buy any materials from your country. We'll bring a lot of the workers, the managers, and the technicians, we will bring from China, because your country, you don't have enough, there are not enough educated people, and there are not enough workers that we can use who can do that kind of work. Maybe we can hire some sort of manual or basic workers in your country, So that's generally their approach. But the Chinese don't think about how can they help local development? How can they help the local industry? How can they, they should think more about buying local materials. And they should also think more about, if they can't find enough local workers, they should think about more training of workers. So to, strengthen their skills. Because when you bring in foreign investment, you of course want that foreign investment to benefit your local development, because that's the whole idea. You want to promote more development in your country. And then another concern I think I have also is the Chinese companies do show a lack of awareness of environmental and social and governance standards, what we call ESG standards. And this is, I think, in large part because of what they are used to in China. I mean, China actually has quite good environmental laws and some good laws on labor, and even some good laws, for example, on gender equality. The problem is often these laws are not implemented or enforced. So there's many cases of Chinese companies that kind of, they do not comply with those laws. They may build a dam but they don't do they're supposed to have some kind of community consultation, but they actually don't hold those community consultations, or they're supposed to do some kind of environmental social impact assessment, but they don't do that, or they do it's just kind of checking the box, right? And so when they go to other countries, they will, of course, if they're not required to do anything else, they will do the same thing. They will follow the country's laws, of course, but if the country does not enforce their own laws very strongly, they will just allow the Chinese company will not do anything more. They will just do the very basic, and you can see this when you look at the, environmental and social impact assessments that are done in other countries. They don't, for the Chinese, the Chinese are very good at getting the project done in time. They do a very good job of that. But the reason for that is because they try to, they don't pay so much attention to the environmental and social impact. They will try to find consulting companies that can do the environmental and social impact assessment quickly. So you can see that they don't really put that much, priority on that part, on the social and environmental part of it. So this is a big problem, and I would say that things are improving, but still the Chinese government does not have many policies for the Belt and Road that really require Chinese companies to do a better job on the environmental and social impact, or on community consultation. And also, when you talk to these companies, Chinese companies, you see that they don't have much staff that they have committed to doing this kind of work. It's usually maybe 1 or 2 people in their company. So, you can see that they haven't really paid much attention. I think the Chinese companies now, there is more emphasis on the importance of environmental, social governance standards, and on community consultation, on CSR, corporate social responsibility, trying to be a responsible business. But I think right now China's still in the kind of early stages, so they're just kind of learning at this point. So that's a concern. Yeah, and I think just kind of one last concern I would say is that there's a lack of feedback mechanisms that are built into these projects. You don't see many chances for the community to give any kind of feedback about the impact of these investment projects. You don't see many community committees that are formed, or you don't see many grievance mechanisms that are set up to provide that kind of feedback. So those are all some concerns that I have after doing the field work in those countries. I think, I have a few suggestions. First of all, I think to recognize that the problems that people see in their communities, the problems that CSOs or community organizations see, those problems are important, and that it's important to monitor and to report those problems, because, as I said before, in these projects, there's often a lack of feedback mechanisms, of grievance mechanisms. So it's important to keep track of that. And then it's important to find ways, I think, to share your findings with other CSOs, with researchers, and also with stakeholders in the government so they know about these problems and can discuss solutions. I think in some countries, there are government agencies or commissions that are set up to monitor these issues. These could be, environmental issues. Certainly environmental issues. There are also commissions set up to monitor gender equality, or disabilities. So these are all, these are agencies that I think need to know that kind of information Because as I said before, that I think CSOs need to help because the government doesn't have the capacity to regulate Chinese investment. CSOs need to help the government, and they can help them by sharing that kind of information. And then finally, I think finding ways. CSOs need to find ways to hold their own governments accountable. I know it's hard to approach Chinese companies, but certainly they have I think they know their country better, and they can find ways to hold their own governments accountable by asking for more information about, for example, the investment agreements or the loan agreements. They can advocate for government agencies to keep more data, to monitor and keep more data on these kinds of investment projects. How many jobs are created by these kinds of projects? I mean, are these good jobs? Are they doing training? Are they hiring women? And also to use the law. I mean, that CSOs should use the laws in their country to hold their governments accountable. I know in a number of countries, we see the use of, CSOs and other stakeholders have filed lawsuits against Chinese projects. And some of those lawsuits actually have been successful in places like Africa and Latin America. I don't know of any cases in Southeast Asia. I mean, certainly they're in Myanmar, you had the Misitoni Dam, which was suspended because of feedback, because of protests, and people were really unhappy about the way that that dam project was carried out. So I think there are cases where that kind of holding governments accountable, it actually works. I would say that they can also think about approaching Chinese companies. It's not as easy. I think the state-owned companies might be easier, maybe even some private companies, but and then also there's the Chinese embassy. I think I know cases of CSOs and communities that have started a discussion, a dialogue with the Chinese embassy in their country. So I think that certainly is worth trying to set up some kind of dialogue as a beginning, as a starting point, and then of course sharing, learning what other CSOs are doing to hold Chinese companies accountable. Because, like I said, there are many good cases out there in other countries where CSOs have had some success in holding Chinese companies accountable. So those are just some suggestions for CSOs.